So one of the fascinating things about the world of work is the terminology that develops and where it comes from, and whether what we call something on the West Coast is recognizable by somebody on the East Coast. And in the United States, a carpenter is a carpenter, and I've learned that in Australia, a carpenter is a chippy. That's interesting to me. And so growing up around logging and kind of small family farm, antique tool kind of environments, when I went to work in Las Vegas, I was working for a foreman on a tilt-up, and his name was Jack Frost, a great guy. And at a particular juncture, I said, we needed a shackle. And I said, Jack, I've got a clevis in the truck. You want me to get it? And he looked at me and he said, yeah. And I came back with something kind of like this, and he said, I haven't heard that called a clevis in a long time. It's a shackle, son. I said, well, yeah, I know, but aren't those terms interchangeable? Well, I've kind of learned since then that clevis is an old term for a shackle, and it is sort of associated with agriculture. You know, really animal-powered agriculture. Clevis was more the term, and now in the modern world, if you ask someone for a clevis, they may or may not know what you're talking about, at least where I live. So why am I talking about shackles and clevises? And I'm about to talk about mollies. What in the world is a molly? That's a molly. That's a molly. That's a molly. And they're all made from cable. And this is what they're called in the logging world. Now, I don't know exactly what that may have reference to. In fact, I don't want to know, because lots of logging draws their euphemisms and metaphors and slang from a rough and earthy world, okay? It's an excellent example of work using what is in the work environment to generate the tools to do the work. So think of logging. You got a lot of cable laying around. I mean, a lot. It breaks all the time. Serious loads. Let me see if I can unwind this. So typical logging and construction cable is 7 strands. You've got 3, oh no, I'm tangled. You've got 3 around the outside surrounding a core. And the lay of the wires in the core and in the outside strands is different. Perhaps you can see that. There are more strands. There's a whole nother level of braiding. The individual 7 strands in here are also twisted in a particular way, and as it turns out, in the opposite direction from what's going on around the sheath. That's weird. I can't explain that to you. But you can take a line apart pretty easily. This is an old rusty thing. It's been laying out in the yard for a long time. And it just loves to come apart if you unwind it in the right direction. Let's see if we can do this and get dirty. And if you go onto old logging sites, find old landings when you're up hunting, there's always chunks of line laying around. And sometimes it's large diameter, and sometimes it's smaller. I mean, obviously that wire came out of a much smaller line. So there's a single strand of a piece of 3/4 inch line. Let me set that aside. Now visualize this. You're working in the brush, and it's wet, or it's snowy, or it's muddy, and it's high speed, and it's dangerous, and you're standing a spar pole, or you're rigging a tree, or you're standing a loading pole, or any number of other rigging challenges that happen, and you can't use one of these. Now see, that's a very high strength shackle. That's made to take a very serious load and to be tightened up with a wrench and to withstand a load. But it's not a safety shackle, because there's no redundancy in stopping it from loosening up. If you're rigging something that has a life safety component and not just an immediate working component, you have to use a safety shackle. A shackle that has a keeper hole in the pin. You see that? So that when it's in place and the nuts put on and something is put through that hole, you know that that will never, worlds without end, loosen up from vibration and the pin drop out and kill anybody. How are you going to keep that? Because everybody's working with white ox gloves, and it's muddy and it's snowy and it's fast, and you have to keep it. And somebody sometime thought, wow, let's just use a piece of wire rope, cable, and run it through that hole, and it'll never come undone. That's a molly. Let's see if we can make a molly out of this big bad boy. they only go together in one direction. Let's see if this is the direction. Looks like it. Yes. That's a molly. Very strong. Use it for a handle. Use it for a way to hang a pulley on the wall. Use it for who knows what. Pretty cool. And use it to keep a safety shackle safe. So I've never worked in the oil field, but I hear, and I imagine it's very similar to logging, everything is heavy. I mean heavy. And the forces that are being applied and unleashed, whether you're falling a tree or hooking onto it with a yarder and heading out, or a cat, or whatever you're doing, you're unleashing forces that are uncontrollable at some point and tear your equipment up. That's why you never see a piece of hemp rope or nylon rope or poly rope on a logging site. It's useless, except maybe as a belt to hold your pants up. Everything would overpower anything except steel. So this is a segment of a 2-inch line off of a main line on a yarder. Think of that. I mean, that is pulling logs in at up to, maybe 25 to 35 miles per hour. This cable is coming onto and off of really seriously big winches. Think of the power that implies. Think of the fact that these things can be broken. Think of the fact that you're standing there on the ground setting chokers and your feet are tangled up in the brush and it's hard to move very far, very fast. And sometimes these forces go bad. It's an exhilarating way to make a living, and it's dangerous, and I miss it on sunny days. These two shackles were roughly similarly configured when they were new, and this one's been stretched. Can you see that? That it's been sort of, the sides have been sucked in, and it's just not quite the way it used to be. It takes a pretty serious pull to stretch a choker like that. This is all carbon steel. The steel in cables works really nice for Damascus swords and knives because the carbon content is whatever it is, but the sort of shelf name for this is improved plowshare, is how the steel that's used in cables is referred to. Incredibly resilient, incredibly fatigue resistant, hard and strong and good stuff. You may never have the experience of working in the woods, but I can tell you, on a spring day, early summer day, when it's not muddy and it's not cold and there's no snow and the conditions are perfect, it's something that a young man is made for. Okay, we're made for that kind of activity. And when you've done it, it changes your approach to work generally and survival instinct and appreciation for the wood products that all of us depend on. The easiest and most intuitive way to use a line or a cable to pull a weight or to lift is by putting an eye in the end of the line. I mean, that's not rocket science. If you don't have a way to hook onto the end of a line, in this case, a factory swedged eye, you see that? This is a swedged ferrule that's squeezed down on to the line so that a hook can get a purchase. But what if you've got a piece of cable that doesn't have an eye in it and you have to pull a load or lift something and you don't know how to splice an eye and you don't have cable clamps big enough to clamp an eye? I'm going to demonstrate how to put something called a farmer's eye in the end of a piece of cable or a line. There we go. See that? Got 3 strands coming off and we're leaving 4 in the core right there. And you see how they want to remain twisted into the same configuration that they were in a few minutes ago? That's key to what we're going to do. You try to leave those strands together and essentially mated with each other the way they were when they were in the line before you disturbed it. And you unwind it quite a ways on a line this size, maybe 2.5 times the distance or the length of the eye you want. Now here's an interesting thing. These lines want to lay together in one direction, and they most emphatically do not want to lay together in the other direction. And sometimes you just have to experiment. Can you see that? They're wanting to go in that direction. Let me show you the difference. If instead I tried to lay them together like this, It's just not going to happen. They just will not mate. The core has worked its way to the outside, but I don't care. You get the idea. You can sometimes, and probably I should have, take the core out of the four-strand side, and just wind up the exterior lines. And what you get is an eye that is stronger than the breaking strength of the line. Can you see that? So now you can put a hook in here. You can go ahead and splice your winch line back together, put an eye in it, and go back to work. You can put a couple of line clamps on here, squish it down, and mostly what that does is just makes it convenient so that you don't have that bitter end sticking out, hanging up. It also removes any possibility of it ever stranding and pulling apart. For usability, you could just take tie wire and wire this down and it'll get you to the end of the day. But to really secure it and have a full strength eye, a couple of line clamps on here are all you need. But in any case, a farmer's eye. It's a trick you can have in your toolkit. It's not near as elegant or as permanent or as professional as a spliced eye, and we'll demonstrate that one of these days on a new piece of line. I don't want to do it with this old rusty thing, but